that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I have a dream today.
Your body went to sleep, but your mind is still caught up in a warfare. Your mind is the battleground.
Psychological Warfare with AJ Norton. So, Dr. John, introduce yourself. Where do you teach and how long have you been teaching?
My name is Dr. John Rich. I teach at Delaware State University, which is in Dover, Delaware. In a couple weeks, when the fall semester begins, I'll be starting my 9th year of teaching.
The 9th year. Wow, time flies.
It sure does, yeah. Prior to that, I was a researcher. My degree is, I have a PhD in educational psychology, which essentially is, it's a research degree that looks at the psychology of teaching and learning, best practices for teachers, how people learn, issues of motivation. And then there's a piece in there that is always talking about the influence of people's backgrounds, the way that they were raised, the parenting that they've been exposed to. And hence, that's the connection to the website that I have.
I was wondering if you could define cognitive bias for the audience.
Well, I suppose that there are plenty of ways to talk about bias. I would say the way that I tend to think about and study bias has to do with people's predispositions to notice certain things and ignore other things so that their opinions are backed up by or confirmed by the evidence that they're taking note of. And so one of the examples that I was thinking of for the purpose of the conversation was the fact that I grew up in Philadelphia. And you may not know this, but in Philadelphia, you are required by law to hate the Dallas Cowboys.
Mm-hmm. The Eagles.
So football. Yes, I'm an Eagles fan. And I hate the Dallas Cowboys. And I appear to have brought up my children to hate the Dallas Cowboys, even though as a scientist and a psychologist that I know that that's completely absurd, that the people who play on the Philadelphia Eagles for the most part didn't grow up in Philadelphia and don't care about Philadelphia in any way. And the people who wear that uniform and play in Irving, Texas, didn't grow up in Dallas, don't really care about Dallas. There's a business transaction that took place, and so the people on the two teams just happen to wear those uniforms and play for that particular company that's making money on their playing time.
Yes, that is a way to put it. You now just see it as a pure business enterprise.
Yeah, well, I'm aware of that rationally, and yet I know that, for example, when I hear about Ezekiel Elliott, I don't know how much you know about football, but Ezekiel Elliott is a running back for the Dallas Cowboys, and he's under investigation for abuse of his girlfriend and some, kind of violent behavior against his girlfriend. And of course, so when we're talking about bias, what that says to me is, see, these Dallas Cowboys, these people are, anyone who plays for the Dallas Cowboys is pure, unadulterated evil. I'm being sarcastic here, but it catches my attention that somebody on the Cowboys is doing something dastardly. And yet there's another guy on the Eagles named Lane Johnson who just got in all sorts of trouble last year for other types of crimes. And I'm willing to let that slide because he wears the green and white jersey. And even as I'm saying it, I know that it's stupid. And yet that, to me, that's a great example of cognitive bias, or another term that I like to use that scientists use called confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the idea that if you have an opinion, you're likely to notice things that happen or things that you observe that match that opinion or confirm that opinion. And when you notice examples of people acting in a way that contradicts the opinion, you either don't notice it at all, or you create excuses or reasons why that person is an exception to the rule, or that person got lucky, or that person is some kind of one of the good ones, so to speak.
Yes. So you start your research almost with a predetermined answer.
Yes, right. And this is one of the classes that I teach is called the scientific method, and one of the things that we talk about right off the bat is that a good scientist is supposed to admit to a hypothesis and then set up a research design to try to disprove the hypothesis. We set a lot of obstacles in our way to our research so that if we still find something that's statistically significant, we're able to more confidently say, look, I tried as hard as I could to disconfirm what I thought was going to happen, and it still happened to such a degree that I have to go along with what I thought was going to happen. But that the average person who's not a scientist, and I don't mean average in that I'm better than them, but I mean the person who's not a scientist by trade, just in their everyday life, or even me when I'm not a scientist and I'm watching football, you're not thinking like that. You're not being critical of your own biases and trying to work against them necessarily. You're actually, your brain is turned on when you see something that confirms your belief and turned off when your brain sees something that goes against your belief. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
Okay.
So you mentioned one type of cognitive bias, and I would classify that, I guess, as geographical, where you rooted for the team that was closest to you.
Okay.
And you found the teams farther away from you. I was a Redskins fan growing up, to your disliking.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not necessarily a Redskins fan either. But if the Redskins are playing the Cowboys, I'll root for the Redskins just because the Cowboys are terrible, awful people, every single last one of them.
Exactly.
Again, being sarcastic.
I feel the same. Yes, exactly,
Right.
though. All in good fun.
Yeah.
Now, I graduated college 3 years ago, and one of the biggest cognitive biases I find out now in my generation is technology.
Okay.
So things like Facebook and Google almost predetermine, they run all these algorithms essentially to make you stay on the site as long as possible.
All right.
So do you have a Facebook, Doctor?
I do.
Okay. So
And I
Facebook.
have a website as well.
Okay. What's your website?
The website is drjohnrich.com, and it's not doctor spelled out. It's just drjohnrich.com.
Okay. I will include that in the show notes.
Okay, thanks.
And things like Facebook only show you what you like.
Interesting. Okay.
In terms of articles, a lot of it comes down to the news feed, right? If you're on your news feed and it's customized to everyone, so it shows you if you like the Kardashians, or if you like sports, or if you like the environment, it will show you things to reinforce that belief. So I
Interesting.
find that,
So you keep getting exposed to things that are confirming your own biases, that the biases are getting worse as a result of seeing, oh, look how many people agree with what I'm saying. Interesting.
it's almost on steroids, because it's underhandedly reinforcing everything, because you don't go on Facebook maybe to do research or get confirmation of something, but you just see it shows you the articles you believe in.
Right. How about that? See, I'm 49, so I'm not necessarily young enough to know as much about those algorithms, but it makes sense to me. On my site, I have Google ads that appear every once in a while, and I know that the way the Google ads work is they use cookies, I guess is what it's called, to try to figure out what you might be interested in, and then the advertisements that pop up are things that are connected to your search history or things like that. So I assume that's a similar phenomenon.
No, it is. Often I'll be on Amazon, and whatever I was searching through will be on an ad later.
How about that? Yes, right. I've noticed that too.
But I was going to segue in. We talked about, I guess, like a technological type of cognitive bias and like a geographical. Have you identified any other types of cognitive bias? For instance, maybe just like the people you surround yourself by or your environment?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, like the person who started talking about prejudice, in particular racial prejudice, uh, in the field of psychology was a guy named Gordon Allport. He actually wrote a book called The Nature of Prejudice. It's still considered a classic. And he talked about how racial prejudice was particularly difficult to get rid of because, for the most part, people of whatever race a person is, the majority of their friends and certainly their family are from that same racial group. And so you're being exposed to the same kind of talking, speech and ideas and attitude and class and social capital and all those other kinds of things that it can make the racial divide more severe because people are separated.
So you reinforce your culture's strengths or weaknesses, and you fail to see maybe the mistreatment of another race in this instance.
Yeah, it could be that, or it could be just the prejudicial ideas that people might have. So, if, for example, talking about confirmation bias, if, for example, you have an opinion that people from a specific ethnic group are lazy, let's say, and then you're driving down the street and you see somebody from that ethnic group sitting on their porch, you don't know why they're sitting on their porch. They could have just gotten off of work, but your brain might be more willing to interpret that observation as, oh, look at this guy just sitting on his porch. Why doesn't he go get a job? You don't even know this person to know that he doesn't have a job, but your opinion is noticing that. And if you drive by and you see somebody from that ethnic group who's working, you may not even notice him, or you might say, exception to the rule. So it's a similar idea.
In your example, is it almost cyclical in a way where if you saw somebody being lazy on your way home, you would then go revibrate that through your friends and say, "Oh, I saw X being lazy"?
It's very possible. I mean, if your group of friends is okay with comments like that, then you could certainly tell that story in a particular kind of way to get the meaningful nod from the people in the group. So Allport talks about in-group and out-group. And in-group and out-group doesn't have to be race. It could be in-group are Eagles fans and out-group are Cowboys fans. Or in-group are people from Pennsylvania and out-group are people from New Jersey. If you're talking about like driving, some kind of prejudice about New Jersey people don't know how to drive or Pennsylvania people don't know how to drive, that's all bias as well. When you notice the license plate of some asshole driver, if I'm allowed to say that, if you notice the license plate of an asshole driver because it's from New Jersey and you say, yeah, look at this asshole, New Jersey, what did I tell you? And then later you're driving down the road and somebody passes you and puts their turn signal on and politely leaves enough distance between you and them before they gradually merge in front of you. And then they wave into their mirror politely. They have a New Jersey license plate. Your brain may not ever pick that up. So he talks about in groups and out groups.
And that's because the second example, they're in the in group.
That's right.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So basically what Allport talked about was something called the ultimate attribution error. So attribution means like, to what do you attribute good and bad things happening? What's the cause of what you're seeing? And so basically he says that when you see positive things from somebody in your group, that's evidence that your group is superior or better or has traits or qualities or characteristics that everybody should admire. And that is helpful to your self-esteem. But when you see people from an out-group acting in a positive way, you're more likely to dismiss it as luck, or that's one of the good ones, that's not really the way most of them are, or that they had some kind of special advantage or something like that. And then conversely, if you see someone from an out-group acting in a negative manner, then that's just grist for the mill. That just shows you that your opinion about that out-group is justified, because look at that right there. That's what I'm talking about.
You weigh the vision that you want way more than anything contradicting it.
How about that? That's nice. That's well said. I like that.
Now, you're an educational psychologist, as you stated
Yeah.
at the beginning, correct? What
Yes.
is your favorite field of psychology?
I think I like social psychology best. When I first applied to go into to get my PhD, I applied for a social psych degree, and they told me that I'd be better suited for educational psychology. I mean, I do like teaching, and I do like talking about parenting and learning and stuff like that. But the ways that people interact with one another, and the ways that our biases get activated based upon who looks like who and who reminds you of this one, and how we can be set off by a person's facial expression without even realizing that that has nothing to do with that person. That has more to do with your dad used to make that facial expression right before he spanked you, or who knows what. Those kinds of things, the ways that we're triggered by interactions with other people, especially when those people come from a different place than I am, those are the things that I am most interested in.
I think it is amazing how, everyone's experiences shape how they act, how they behave, and how you meet them for that moment in time. And you truly don't really know why someone responds to something unless you understand maybe 20 years of their past.
Right, yeah. Well, I think Freud, if I can put words in his mouth, would probably have said that nobody really knows anybody else, let alone themselves. That everybody we meet is just a projection of our own past onto other people's bodies. We're reacting to them in a way that's not really objectively a true reaction to that other person. It's really, we're just layering on top of their face all of the other experiences we've had in the past. This is amazing that anybody can get along with one another.
Well said. No, it is just like Freud said, where we don't even know ourselves. I find it often that I'll find somebody and I really don't see them as being funny or enjoyable, mostly the people I work with sometimes. And I'll see my friends and they may not be that more energetic, but I'll see them as, some positive sun ray of life, of sunshine in my life.
Uh-huh.
Now, you mentioned Freud. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but one thing Freud stated is that people are more driven by emotional arguments than logical arguments.
I don't know if Freud said that. I haven't heard that. I know that Freud really believed that the primary things that motivate us are underneath the surface of our consciousness, that we're not really aware of most of the reasons that we react and think the way that we do. And the purpose of therapy is to try to bring more of that to the surface so that we can make real intentional choices.
Okay, well said. Thank you. This is why I like learning.
Learning is great. It's nice to get paid to learn.
Yes, that's what you get to do.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about, I guess, the problems of cognitive bias. I guess one of the biggest solutions for cognitive bias we move to now would be being more aware. Now, you can never be completely aware, but as I went back to the internet, or maybe we can go back to sports to become more appreciative of all the NFL teams. But as for the internet, you have this ability to look up any evidence pretty much ever recorded. And you can use this to be more aware. But as I stated, often if you just stick to maybe social media, it's a filter, it's a bubble for your bias where you only find what you like, tweet, and share.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the more that you become aware of the other side, the more human that other side can appear. I'm struck by the ways, and I'm not trying to be political or anything, but I'm struck by the ways that the current Republican Congress is angry at the Democrats for being obstructionist, when not too long ago it was the other way around, and then not too long before that it was the other way around, and then before that it was the other way around, that they're acting the same way toward each other. But when you're in power, you criticize it, and when you're not in power, you try to block it. And so it's amazing how politically the same things keep happening. And then depending on who has the more powerful voice, those behaviors are either good or bad.
No, and I think, confirmation bias plays a huge role in today's politics. What you just pointed out, it's hard to remember, 8 years ago, essentially the same thing happened. The same, it was just the flipping of the sides. The Eagles were now the Cowboys, and the Cowboys were now the Eagles in
nice. Yeah.
other people's minds. And
good connection. Yeah.
And it plays out like that every day.
Yeah. So, I am more on the lefty side of things, but with some regularity, I turn on Fox News instead of watching some of the other MSNBC or whatever, just to hear how the same story is being presented in an entirely different way. And what it wakes me up to is not necessarily that the one side is right and the other side is lying, as much as that both sides are presenting the case in a way that is of the greatest self-interest. Yeah.
It's almost become tribal in a way.
Yeah.
Where it's about respecting your group and tribe and trying to empower them, and that person is the enemy. Whereas politics should be about coming together and trying to be aware of how we can fix everyone's problem.
Yeah, well, it's not like that. It's more and more belligerent from my perspective, even to the point where I'm a member of a number of Facebook pages that are about parenting, just so I can be part of the conversation, not to mention promoting what I'm writing. And every once in a while, I'll post something about my belief that you shouldn't spank your children, for example. And the reaction that I get sometimes from some people is, here's this left-wing ivory tower.
Left-wing nutcase.
Yeah, is another nutcase or whatever. Or even more interestingly, and here's another area where people are, where confirmation bias comes into play. I get, what do you call it? Accused, I guess is the right word, of being a homosexual. I must be a homosexual because I don't spank my kids, or my kids are gonna end up being gay because I don't spank them. I'm not sure where this opinion comes about that the more softly you are treated by your parents, the more inclined toward homosexuality you're going to be. But it's clearly people just kind of acting out of their own belief system without knowing anything about me. I'm trying to just make an argument about something based on research, and then there are personal attacks leveled against me that aren't even accurate, let alone kind or rational.
No, the internet kind of adds this extra interface where you can throw negativity or throw shade, as I call it, without really any repercussions.
Yeah, right.
For
Yeah,
instance,
I don't know who
if
these.
I was to stand up in your class and just call you out, or maybe say
Right.
the same thing on the internet, I would face some repercussion over that.
Right. Yes. Right. Good point. Nobody would say, yeah, these people are very likely not going to say that to anyone's face. But behind the screen and your avatar, you can say almost anything. And it seems like some people get a certain amount of glee from, what did you say? Casting shade or throwing shade
Yes.
or
People call it trolling now, but yeah.
right, trolling. Right. Yes. Well, I've been the victim of some trolling ever since I started putting myself out there, and I wasn't prepared for it at first. Now I'm getting used to it.
Okay. I think it's
Yeah.
good you're getting used to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Facebook's a hard place to, quote, put yourself out there. I would also say the internet and Facebook, it's a breeding ground for not only choosing sides, but being very one way or another way. So a lot of the reactions you probably either get really negative or really positive reactions.
Yes,
Because
that's correct.
people who feel neutral usually don't interact or comment on things that they're neutral to.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that until just now, but that's true. I'm getting the impression that everybody is just really hot or really cold about everything I have to say. but
Yes.
But in fact, if I did the numbers, I'll bet you the majority of people don't have much of an opinion, but that's true that those people don't chime in and say, oh, well, I didn't find that very interesting, but whatever. That nobody's going to take the time to write that.
Yes, no, people would only post something if they got, I guess, triggered.
Yes.
Positively or negatively.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good point. I hadn't put that together.
Yeah, no, it has so many layers which interest me. And also, so when you post in these groups, maybe there's only 10 people, but there could be millions of people, typically thousands of people. So you are showing your work or your writing to a lot more people than maybe you even teach in class. So let's just say if even 1% of those people are triggered one way or another, that could be 3,000 people. If you have a 300,000 person group and you trigger 1%, you're going to get 3,000 comments.
Right.
Which is too much for like a one human to take in. I don't.
Yeah. Well, I'm my site's only a few months old, so I don't have that kind of volume yet. But that's a little scary to think that if it grows too much, I'm gonna be fielding that much hate and that much love. Right. I suppose another area of bias is that if you're surrounded by people who are always telling you how great you are, and that's the only group that you have around you, certain leaders, probably people that other people fear, Putin perhaps, or something like that, you're going to come to believe that you're hot shit.
No, there are famous stories of the current North Korean president, and he tells the people, or the people know, like he golfs in 18.
Yes, right.
He has never gone to the bathroom.
Yeah, right. And you better not say no. Yeah. How many people have told Putin he looks good with his shirt off? He must have had a lot of people, because every year he's out there on his boat with his shirt off, and he looks okay for however old he must be, but he doesn't look that great.
No, yeah, he's in the nature. They're pretty funny.
If we've got a gap in what we're going to talk about, I want to go back to something that you asked earlier, which is related to, what should people do? And one of the things that you said that we talked about was exposing yourself to the other point of view. And the other thing that I would say that's similar is exposing yourself, putting yourself in situations where you get to interact, preferably face to face, with people from another background. There's a lot of research that shows, for example, that the one way that you can get rid of racial prejudice is if the people holding the racial prejudice are put in a situation where they have to work on an equal level with people from that other group. It's not good. Like if you have a racism against African Americans, and then an African American comes along and he's your boss, or she's lower than you on the totem pole. That doesn't do it. But if you're working, for example, on the loading dock with somebody who's African American, you have the same title and the same pay and the same status. Over time, after repeated exposure to this other human being, you need to let go of some of those biases because they don't match what you're seeing.
So you kind of then will come to the view that, hey, they get tired just like I do, they talk like I do, they share interests like I do, and you start to unearth that they're not that different.
Yeah. And when you reached out for people, one of the things that you said you were looking for was a conversation not just about bias, but also something called cognitive dissonance. Mm-hmm. And this is an example of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance means you have two things that are in your mind at the same time that contradict one another. So, for example, if I believe that people who wear some certain kind of, in my school, the students are really against people who wear skinny jeans. This is ridiculous. If anyone wears skinny jeans, that they look stupid. And so I say, well, what if you meet some guy and he's a great guy and you start dating and you're in totally head over heels in love with this person, and one day he shows up for a date wearing skinny jeans. Well, now you've got a problem because you've been talking shit about people with skinny jeans all this time, and here's this person that you admire who needs to be perhaps lumped into that same category. So you have to do some mental juggling. You either have to change your opinion about the skinny jeans and say, well, they don't look that bad on him, and make some kind of exception to the rule. You have to say, well, the skinny jeans are actually not that bad now that I actually see them face to face or something. Or you have to break up with the guy. You can't keep those two contradictory thoughts in the same brain. And so same thing with prejudice. If you encounter an African American and now you become friends with this person and you're joking around and you really like them and you're connecting, and you still have these prejudicial thoughts, something's got to give. You either have to admit that you were wrong about your prejudice and let that wither away, or you have to decide that you really don't like this other person after all in order to hold on to your prejudice, or you have to create some kind of exception and say that this person that you've met is the exception. And so just meeting one person from the other group and getting to know them is not enough to fight prejudice. You have to meet multiple people who constantly defy and contradict your opinion before you're going to have to let the opinion go because there's too much evidence to the contrary.
Okay. So cognitive bias and cognitive dissonance work together in a way that the dissonance brings the two images, the two choices to your mind, mental
Right.
side. And then if you're biased, maybe you always choose A. You always choose the Eagles.
Yeah, it's possible, right?
But the dissonance could repeatedly bring up the Cowboys, and you could repeatedly see, for instance, yes, all these incidences of prejudice not being true.
Right.
It's up to you to eventually affirm that belief or see
Yeah,
that.
Right. So when I was saying that when you see confirmation bias says that when you see something that goes against your bias, you don't notice it. Well, after repeated exposures to things that contradict your bias, eventually your brain is going to notice. And now your brain has to do something to resolve the contradiction.
Okay. No, I think that's a great way of putting it, is that you always want to put yourself in situations where you may feel uncomfortable or challenge you to expose biases.
Yeah. If that's your goal, to get rid of your bias. Some people say, well, the bias, it's not a bias, it's the truth or whatever. Yeah.
No, I think you could put that to some of our politicians. I don't think any of them would change no matter how much evidence you gave them.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah.
No, back to cognitive dissonance. So it's almost akin to you're watching a movie and maybe you're in a movie theater and you see everyone is watching two different movie screens. And on one screen, you have one movie, and on the other screen, you have the same movie, but it's a totally different story. It's a totally different view of how the story is being portrayed. And everyone may be in the movie theater, but people could be watching completely different movies than you are.
Yeah, that's good. Do you know the story of Wicked? That reminds me of that story.
Do you know that? I have not. That's a play, correct? I have not seen it.
It's a play. It's also a book. It was originally a book, and the book is basically telling the story of the Wizard of Oz, but from the perspective of the quote unquote evil witch who survives, not the one that gets the house that falls on her, but her sister, who's also supposed to be evil, and telling that story and basically trying to present another perspective that woman was not necessarily evil. She's mad at Dorothy for killing her sister. And there's a backstory where Glinda, who's supposed to be the good witch, is actually kind of power hungry. And so it's just taking the story and spinning it on its head and making you look at it from another perspective where Dorothy's not necessarily all pristine. And Glinda, from what I remember, is definitely not somebody to be admired once you learn some of the things that happened in the past. So that your story about the two movies reminded me of that. You can tell the same story, but when it's seen through another eye. Didn't Clint Eastwood do something like that with World War II? I didn't see either of them, but I think.
Do you mean someone made a television series where essentially the Japanese, the enemies, the opposite of the Allies wins?
Oh, I haven't seen that either, but I think that Clint Eastwood made two movies back to back about World War II, and one was the American perspective, and then the other one took place in Japan and followed the Japanese around. And
okay, awesome.
So kind of a similar idea.
Yes. No, I was thinking, have you seen Game of Thrones?
I have, yes.
Okay. So in Game of Thrones, kind of a huge difference for me than a lot of other TV shows is there's no main character. You go through every character's story, and each character has their motives. And most people root for a character, but a lot of the premise of the show is very good and built on that anyone can die at any time. And it is akin to almost real life, where you don't always have a Voldemort or a Hitler, like someone who's pure evil, but you have someone who has their motive and drive, and that may be against you, but they're not totally out to get you. They just have a drive that's against you, whether it's because they have a business competing with you or something, but they have basically this whole story that now is concocted to at least, be enemies with you, but they're not enemies with you in like how a movie would portray them, where it's total good versus evil, and you're on one whole side, and they're on the total side of pure evil.
With the exception of what do they call it? The White Walkers?
That's true. They've introduced a pure evil element.
Those are pure evil. Nobody feels badly at all when they get killed with the dragon glass or whatever. But otherwise, even Cersei, who has a lot of evil qualities and even evil looks on her face when she does certain things, it does present it so that you understand where she's coming from, at least.
No, yes. Even Cersei has qualities that some people can find attractive. She loves her family and children, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's a good analogy. I like that.
Another good point is cognitive bias can seep in anywhere, right? And it's I guess that almost could be a point where to be fully aware of yourself, and this is why cognitive bias is so prevalent, is almost impossible.
Yeah, I think a lot of psychologists would say we're more biased than we are unbiased. Because bias is easier. Unbiased requires a lot of work and effort and intentionality, and bias is just going along with what you always thought or what your parents told you or what your pastor says or what the politicians tell you or what the news program says. You don't have to do anything but just say, yeah, that's it. Just agree.
Gotcha. And to get out of your bias, you actually have to do a lot of work where, for instance, just meeting new people may be very hard to do. You may have to leave your town. You may have to join a whole different group at college. You may have to wake up at a different time, go to a different bar to root for your different sports team.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't know if I'll do that, but yeah, right. Yeah, I agree. And the other thing that you have to do that is incredibly difficult for a lot of people is you have to admit that you might not be right. And a lot of people have a need to be right.
Yes, and that's what cognitive dissonance is hard to admit, is that you are being shown a alternative fact.
Right. And then, what does that say about, but my mom always told me, and now you have to, maybe my mom was wrong about that, or the Bible says, and then you find out that the Bible maybe was written a long time ago or something like that. So there's a lot of things you have to let go if you start discovering that an opinion that you've held on to that has guided your life to some degree turns out to be an error. And it's just a lot of work. It's just a lot of work.
No, and you bring up a good point in that biases can be woven together with emotions. So I remember when I started college and a lot of people invited me to their Christian group, and I'm not too religious, but I never went. And one time I went and I realized why people were so fervorous about it, so vociferous about it. And it was because it was really a community of friends. They went there, they did their prayer, but then afterwards they hang out, they became friends, they went swimming together. And so that Christianity, in this case, was tied with the emotions of friendship.
Nice.
And
That's
like
good.
Like you said with the childhood, if somebody tells you Santa Claus doesn't exist, well, Santa Claus may have played a very strong role in your childhood. It may be at the time your family came together, when you got presents, when you loved one another. And for someone to attack Santa Claus, to you, they're attacking those emotions you feel about the great times in Christmas.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And then now that makes me think about these people who are calling me gay because I don't think you should spank your kids. And, if you were spanked and maybe there are some hard memories there that you'd rather not think about, it might be easier to say, because the reaction that you get is, well, I was spanked and I turned out fine. And that statement is laced with so much profanity and hate that if I respond at all, I'll say something like, yeah, you sound lovely. I don't know how fine you turned out, but that's interesting to talk about how the emotional side is part of what you don't want to give up.
Mm-hmm. No, nothing for me showcases this more, at least on the national level, than the climate change argument.
Okay.
So if I watch Fox News, CNN, they have basically side A, side B, denier and pro-climate change. And so they have a scientist on usually, and sometimes in the anti-climate change, a non-scientist. But it's almost like the pro-climate change person, Bill Nye maybe, appeals to you logically. He states some facts, he may show some graphs, whereas the anti-climate change plays to you emotionally, where he says, this is the government taking too much power. They want to regulate your water and take away your freedom.
Right. Okay.
It's almost like when they use that word freedom, they're placating to you emotionally. Because we grow up and we hear the word freedom a lot. We fought for our freedom. This country was
Freedom's
established for freedom from the British.
Right. Yep. Freedom from the British. That's right. Nobody's scared of the British anymore.
No.
They used to be pretty scary.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate it. That was a really great conversation, I thought.
Hey everyone, it's me, AJ again. Thank you for listening. As always, all the show notes and links mentioned in this episode are on my website at psychowarfare.com. You can also go there to sign up for my email list and stay up to date on new content and updates. As always, feel free to email me with ideas, advertisers, or improvements, especially aj@psychowarfare.com. AJ, 2 letters. Have the best day of your lives, ladies and gents.